Hi theory students. Today we'll be talking how to write the basic phrase in what we call SATB style. That stands for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. In part 1, we'll talk about how to notate this 4-part harmony style. The soprano, alto, tenor, and bass voices are roughly the higher and lower women's voices and the higher and lower men's voices. We use 4-part writing because if we want to fill out chords, we find that 4-part is the perfect balance between 3-note triads and enough flexibility to give each voice good contours. What I mean by that is that in order to have all 3 notes of the chord covered, having that extra voice allows the voices not to have to jump around quite a lot. The way we notate this is to put the soprano and alto on the treble staff, the tenor and bass on the bass staff, and each pair separated by stems up and down. So it'll look a little bit like this. So here, for example, we might have soprano and alto there, and tenor and bass there. By putting the stems this way, it allows visually for us to see each of the 4 parts separately. So if you're singing alto, it's easy to follow your part. You're having all of the stems down. If you're a soprano, you're singing the notes all with stems up. And for anyone playing all 4 parts, you can see all of them at a glance and which parts are which. If we're notating a unison, in other words, the same note for 2 different voices, if they're on the same staff like there, we'll put a stem up and a stem down with the same note head. Note, by the way, that if the unison is between alto and tenor, this is a little tricky, but I've got to write the separate note heads. In other words, I can't do something like that because the alto voice belongs on the treble staff, the tenor voice belongs on the bass staff. I can't combine them somewhere in the middle. And also the letter line to the treble staff needs to be the same spacing as that. And likewise, the treble line for the bass staff needs to be the same spacing as a normal space on the staff. What do I do if I have a whole note and there are no stems? Then I write the 2 note heads side by side like that. Each voice has its own range. In other words, notes that it can sing both from the lowest to the highest. Here's what the ranges look like for each of the 4 voices. For soprano, you can write from middle C up to the G there. For the alto, from the low G up to the D. For tenors, roughly an octave below the sopranos. And for bass, you would think it would be an octave lower than the alto, but actually we sometimes ask the basses to sing even a few notes lower than that. Note, by the way, the ledger lines at the low point for the alto, at the high point for the tenor. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong if you're using these ledger lines. It just means that bass clef is not ideal for the tenor range, and treble clef is not ideal for the alto range. Okay, next, we would like to avoid what we call voice crossing. This is where the soprano dips lower than the alto, or the tenor dips above the alto, or the tenor dips below the bass. Think of these in the same way you might want to think of lanes. And at any given point, they can touch like that. But they can't, if that's a soprano and that's the alto, they can't cross each other. That's what voice crossing is. Spacing, what we'd like to have is an octave or less between the alto and the voice higher than it, the soprano, and the voice lower than it, the tenor. It looks something like this. So if that's the alto note, we want the tenor note to be no farther away than that, and the soprano no farther away than that. The bass can be more than an octave away from the tenor. We don't care how far away the bass is from the octave or the soprano. So, for example, this would be an acceptable spacing. Here's the alto and less than an octave there or there. This would not be acceptable because there's more than an octave between the alto and soprano. We need to be particularly careful between the alto and tenor, because they're on different staves. Sometimes they can be widely spaced and we don't know it until we actually examine what the notes are. E over here and C down there. So watch carefully for spacing. Again, they can be on the same pitch, or they can be an octave apart, as these are. And now, since we have 4 voices and 3 notes in chords, we're going to be duplicating or doubling one of the notes of the chord. So we've got some guidelines for doubling. We generally avoid doubling altered notes or tendency tones. Very often a tendency tone would be something like a leading tone. So when we have a leading tone, scale degree 7, we usually try doubling one of the other notes. So if it's a 5 chord with scale degrees 5, 7, and 2, that might be a good note to double, and that might be a good note to double. That one is not. When we have a root position chord, we usually double the bass, which in this case is the root of the chord. Other doublings are possible, but much less common. If we have a second inversion chord, one in 6/4 position, we double the bass, which in this case is the 5th of the chord. If we have a diminished triad, we usually write it in first inversion or 6/3 position and double the 3rd or 5th of the chord. The reason for that, there's a diminished triad. If we double the root, then we're emphasizing the tritone or diminished 5th or augmented 4th, and that makes the chord sound more dissonant. Doubling the third of the chord and getting the root out of the bass softens the tone of the diminished triad. And finally, the most complicated is the first inversion. That's the most flexible. Sometimes we double the soprano, or sometimes we aim to double what we call the tonal scale degrees. Think of those as the ones that don't change between a minor and a major mode. Or sometimes we double the note that makes for the smoothest voice leading from one to the next. As mentioned before, avoid doubling tendency tones like the leading tone. So for example, in the key of C, if I wanted to do something like this, what I might do in this particular case, I'm doubling the root C. There it is in the soprano. That's a root position chord. Here's my first inversion chord. I move the E down to C. What I end up doing now, I'm doubling the soprano. I'm also doubling one of the stronger tonal scale degrees, scale degree 1. So that will work as well. Now, if I go in this case, to a 2/6, in this particular case, the alto and bass are doubled. F is scale degree 4, and that's one of the stronger scale degrees, so that will work as well. When I go to the 5 chord in root position, in this particular case, actually, the best doubling may be something like this, where it's root position and I'm doubling the root of the chord in the outer voices. Altogether, it sounds like this. We'll learn a lot more about doubling as we go along, but those are the basic guidelines. We'll continue with the next part of the chapter in the next video. That's all for today.